I think we are ready to start. So we are delighted to introduce the keynote lecture of our international conference, Fairy Tale Trouble and the Art of Fluidity, hosted by the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. And Vanessa Joosen is a full professor of English literature and children's literature at the University of Antwerp, where she organizes the Children's Literature Summer School. A distinguished scholar, she is renowned for her innovative research and significant contributions to fairy tale studies, age studies, translation studies, and digital humanities. She is the author, amongst others, of Critical and Creative Perspectives on Fairy Tales, Adulthood in Children's Literature, and co-author of Age in David Almond's Of, and she edited Connecting Childhood and Old Age in Popular Media, and with Gillian Lethe brings tales around the globe. As Vice President of the International Research Society for Children's Literature, Vanessa Joosen plays a key role in shaping the field globally. Through her research, teaching and leadership, she continues to inspire scholars and students as one of the foremost experts in children's literature today. So we are very honored to have her with us today. And the title of her lecture is How Old is Snow White? Considering the fairest of them all from an age studies perspective. Welcome back.
Thank you. That's a very generous introduction. I hope not too generous. I hope I don't disappoint after the very high expectations you've set. But I'm incredibly happy to be here. I want to say thanks, of course, to Elena and Alicia for inviting me, for giving me this honor, but also for organizing such a wonderful conference with such a great theme. And it's nice to be in a room that's full of people who I consider inspiring colleagues, and also I'm very curious to hear the work of the people I don't know yet. So I think it's a great setting. Thank you so much. My first slide is deliberately very bland and has no pictures because I didn't want to influence you visually before I asked the following question, and this is a little interactive gimmick. So if you have a smartphone, you can scan the QR code and answer the question, and feel free also to put in a guess if you don't know the answer. How old is Snow White when, in the grim tale, the mirror starts calling her the most beautiful? So also if you don't know, just feel free to guess. How old do you think she is when that happens? 12:45. 10, 12, 9. Oh, sorry. I can't scroll down to the 280. Yeah. We're talking about the figure Snow White, not the tale, of course. I did see the correct answer on the slide, but also many of you were a little confused, which is I'll reveal the answer in a moment. Now, in children's literature, fairy tales hold a unique position because of their long and rich history of oral and written transmission. Because of their status as what Alida Asman calls written folklore, these stories also display a particular flexibility. And these are just a few examples from Dutch that I've added here. Time and again, storytellers, authors and illustrators, as well as creators in other media, such as film and games and memes, have given new meanings to classic fairy tale plots and characters. As a result, this material provides unique opportunities to study aspects of cultural evolution, including ideas about particularly fluid concepts such as age. Moreover, fairy tales are so familiar that we often do not think about them, and they may start to surprise us or start to intrigue us once we start paying attention to elements that we've also always just taken for granted. Now in this talk, I will look into the history of one particular tale, Snow White, and reflect on what considerations of age drawn from childhood studies and age studies can offer to fairy tale studies, and vice versa, what the history of fairy tales can perhaps teach us when we think about age in literature. But let me start with the question that I raised in the title of this talk: how old is Snow White? Recently, I also asked this question at a conference in Umeå in Sweden. It was a conference this fall. As you can see here, most of the participants thought that she was either 13 or 14, and the age range in which they placed Snow White was from 8 years old to 17 years old. I do have to acknowledge that there was also a person who thought she was 50 years old, but I'm assuming that was meant as a joke. Now, interestingly, none of these people got it right. But of course, it's a difficult question to answer, because in the Grimm's tale, Snow White's age is not stable. Oh, sorry. No, that's actually, I deleted the slide there. Sorry. Snow White's age is not stable. We witness her life from pre-birth, when her mother is dreaming of a child, you know, with who's as white as snow, red as blood, and black as ebony wood. And then we see her grow up until her marriage to the prince. Now, many fairy tales and many other children's books, for that matter, never mention an explicit age for their characters. If we look at the Brothers Grimm's collection, we never learn how old Little Red Riding Hood is, or Hansel and Gretel, or characters like Rumpelstiltskin and Rapunzel. So for someone who's interested in age, it's all the more fascinating when a specific age does get mentioned. And a well-known example of this is Briar Rose. So in the Grimm's tale, she pricks herself with a spindle in her 15th year. And in Perrault's version of the same tale, The Sleeping Beauty, that same event happens when 15 or 16 years have passed after her christening ceremony. Now, some adaptations, such as the Disney movie from 1959, even locate that event more precisely on her 16th birthday. I always wonder, why didn't her parents watch her better on that day? Well, there you go. I also have a 16-year-old, so I know what it's like. Of course, from a contemporary view, this age still makes sense, right? In the US, we've seen these Sweet 16 parties for a long time. They've now also arrived in Belgium. I don't know if they're celebrated in your countries. In Belgium, 16 is also the minimal age when young people can drink a beer. So in many ways, it's seen as an age of transition from childhood to adulthood. So 16 is an age that makes sense. And yeah, perhaps you saw that the people in Umeå also chose 16 quite frequently as a potential age for Snow White. But for Snow White, this age is less well known, I think, than for Sleeping Beauty. And she is given a numerical age there as well. Now let's use as a starting point, the final edition of the Brothers Grimm tale, the one from 1857, Die Ausgabe Letzter Hand, as it's called in German. There we learn that Snow White dies when she is born, and that the king remarries after a year. She gets a stepmother. You all know that the stepmother has a magic mirror. The mirror calls the stepmother the fairest of them all, but this changes when Snow White is 7 years old. The mirror from then on considers her the most beautiful in the kingdom. And as soon as this happens, the queen, of course, starts hating Snow White. She sends her out with the woodsman. He lets her escape. She arrives at the seven dwarfs' house, and after that, the subsequent passages leave the passing of time a bit vague, and hence also, you know, the aging process of Snow White becomes a bit vague. So there is no explicit mention of years passing while she's living there. We do know that the queen is always very eager to find out if she is still the most beautiful in the kingdom after she's tried to kill Snow White, first with the huntsman, then with the magic laces, then with the poisoned comb, then with the apple. Each time, she rushes home to find out if she's still the most beautiful in the world. We do learn that when she has to devise the first trick, the magical laces, that it takes her some time to come up with something, but how much time we don't know. So this may, so it's very well possible that Snow White is not much older than 7 years old when she bites the poisoned apple. Only when she lies in the glass coffin we find out that lange Zeit, or a long time, passes while she remains looking the same as when she, bit the apple. So that indicates that her body does not decay, but does it also mean that she does not grow up or grow older? And if she does grow up and grow longer, how does that work with the glass coffin? Again, the details are left vague. And of course, you may wonder, do we have to ask questions like this? We're dealing with a fairy tale. It's not a realist novel. But I still think it's worth asking these questions because fairy tales also transmit ideas of age, and I'll be going into that in a moment. So the only explicit mention of age is the age of 7, when the mirror calls her the most beautiful in the kingdom. And that age may come as a surprise to some of you. It's definitely come as a surprise to some people who've explicitly expressed unease with this age. For example, on her blog, Jane Gilmore writes, "The Grimm brothers edited out the cannibalistic mother, but their little Snow White was only 7 years old, and they had no qualms about marrying her off to the handsome prince." And in a fictionalized conversation between Wilhelm and Jacob Grimm, called The Awful Story of Snow White, the Flemish author Thomas Crombie also thematizes this surprise. So Wilhelm says, "How can a child of 7 years old be more beautiful than an adult woman?" And Jacob responds, "That's how it goes in these old stories. Shut up and keep writing." Now, of course, much more often than these explicit debates about her age, we see that her age is often adapted and changed more implicitly. So in a study of Dutch translations of Snow White that I carried out of translations since the mid-19th century, I noted that the majority deleted the mention of age or made Snow White older. For example, 14 was quite a common age. Moreover, in more modern retellings, we also see that Snow White's age is often adapted. So Anne Sexton says that in her famous poems writes, say she was 13, and in The Age of the Apple by Emma Donoghue, she is called the most beautiful shortly after she started menstruating. Moreover, many illustrators have also adapted her age, but we'll look into that at the end of my talk. So before we go there, I want to raise a question: where does the age of 7 come from, and what meanings can we give to that age? And I will use different methods to explore this from different angles. And I'll first start with a genetic approach. So a genetic approach refers to the French paradigm of critique génétique, and it's a method that studies manuscripts, but also epigenesis as it's called, so also the publication history of the story. And of course, those who are familiar with the Brothers Grimm, and I'm assuming many of you are, will know that the Brothers Grimm's collection went through various editions. So when we're talking about the Grimm Snow White, we're actually not talking about one version, but more or less 10 versions of this tale. And particularly interesting in this respect is, of course, also the Eulenberg manuscript of 1810. The Tale of Snow White went through many changes. The most famous is, of course, the replacement of her mother with a stepmother in the edition of 1819, so before it was Snow White's own mother, who wanted to be the most beautiful in the world and wanted to kill her daughter. But there are also various other changes. And so in the edition of 1810, no age is mentioned when Snow White is called the most beautiful. She just always seems to have been so. But this age appears for the first time in 1812. And so at the University of Antwerp, we've built a tool that allows for a quick comparison between all the different versions. That's one of the advantages of having colleagues specializing in digital humanities. So I built it together with Vanessa and Dirk van Hul. And so what you see in the tool is that every time that something changes, it's marked in purple. So it immediately lights up. And so you see that in 1812 is the time that 7 years old, first appears. This doesn't change anymore, except that in 1819 they add that she gets ever more beautiful. So where does this age of 7 come from then? So the Grimms would keep adapting their tales, and usually based on 3 elements. First, if they collected additional oral versions of a tale. Second, if they encountered more written sources of a certain tale, they might use that to adapt it. And finally, they also applied certain editorial principles to create a consistent fairy tale aesthetic. In German, this is called die Gattung Grimm, the genre Grimm. Now, as far as I could find, no additional oral or written versions of the story motivated this change from an unaged girl to a 7-year-old girl. So let's consider then the possibility of the 7 years old as part of the Grimm's fairy tale aesthetic. So first, the appearance of a specific age seems to be a question of story logic, since in the same edition of 1812, they added that the queen looks into that magic mirror every morning. So this requires some sort of tipping point, right? A specific morning when Snow White is the most beautiful. But of course, any other age or a very vague mention, such as one day Snow White was the most beautiful, would have also done the trick. But 7 is, of course, one of the numbers that the Grimms like to work with as part of their fairy tale aesthetic. As many scholars, like Jack Zipes, for example, have observed, the Grimms added numerous Christian references in the course of their editorial process, and the holy numbers were part of that. And that's especially true for Snow White. Sorry, this is the every morning that you see here, but here I've highlighted every time that 7 is mentioned, and in the manuscript you can also see the number 7 appears quite often, yeah? So it was already part of the tale with the 7 dwarfs, with their 7 cups, plates, knives, beds, and so forth. So adding the age of 7 for Snow White strengthens this leitmotif of 7 in the process. But I think there's more, because in the same edition of 1812 we see another element pop up in the story, the huntsman. So in the 1810 manuscript, it was the queen herself who took Snow White to the forest and left her there to be devoured by wild animals. In 1812, the huntsman is ordered to kill her, but he takes pity on her, and her age may be a crucial factor in that process, especially because from 1819 onwards, and that's what you see here, he calls her "Du armes Kind," or "you poor child," before he releases her in the forest. Similarly, from then on, the dwarfs also call her a child when they find her in one of their beds, and in 1837, so that's slightly later, the narrator also adopts this stance to raise pity, also calling her a poor child. In fact, she gets more and more helpless In 1812, she's still thinking about how to help herself, but in 1837, it says that she doesn't know how to help herself, so she doesn't even think about it. Finally, we see that her size is also shrinking in the process compared to the 7 dwarfs. So in 1810 and 1812, only the largest dwarf's bed fits her, whereas from 1819 onward, it reads, one was too long, the other too short, until the 7th was exactly right. So now at least one dwarf is taller, and maybe more, is taller than Snow White. So relatively, she becomes smaller. So I think that in all these scenes, her smallness seems there to elicit an effective response, to raise other characters and perhaps also the reader's sympathy for her fate. And for children, a younger Snow White may also increase the potential for identification. Now, in interpreting characters' construction of age, 2 perspectives can be adopted, a semiotic and a mimetic one, and I refer to Marie Nikolaeva's rhetoric of character here. What I've just done falls under a semiotic perspective. I've considered internal logic, the generic features, and the plot requirements of the story to make sense of Snow White's age, as well as the potential effective response in the implied audience that the text is trying to provoke. But fictional characters, even in fairy tales, may also elicit a mimetic response, as we draw on our knowledge of the real world to make sense of them, and as they, in turn, may also inform ideas that we have about people in the real world. And of course, that is one of the reasons that people are so interested in children's literature. What do these characters teach us, and what may children take on in their understanding of the world? And it's here that age studies comes into play. So age studies is a very rich interdisciplinary field that grew out of gerontology studies in the mid-20th century. Old age is still a big area of interest of this field, but it also looks more broadly at age and at the life course. And it unites scholars working in various fields, in medicine, in biology, but also in the humanities, for example, law studies. A lot of sociologists are working in age studies, and also people studying culture and the arts. Now, one of the key ideas that's been criticized by sociologists in this field is the pervasive cult of youth in Western society, which finds a match in the decline narrative for old age. So the decline narrative posits that people's skills, but also their social value and their quality of life goes downhill once they are past or in middle age. As Susan Pickard describes it, our defining existential crisis is our fear of aging and old age. And this age ideology, as she calls it, has damaging consequences for everyone. So not just for people in old age, but for people in all stages of life. Age scholars argues children's literature and fairy tales have played a part in transmitting that damaging age ideology. For example, age critic Sylvia Henneberg has pointed out with the telling title, Moms Do Badly, Grandmas Do Worse, that sexism and ageism reinforce each other in figures such as the wicked old witch and the weak old crone. With the weak old crone, Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother could be an example. Of course, we also see the cult of youth and the decline narrative expressed in Snow White, where the mother or stepmother loses her status as the most beautiful in the kingdom when she grows older and is replaced by someone from the next generation. And then the story starts to evoke a plot of lethal intergenerational rivalry between 2 women. Now, if we follow the Grimm's edition of the descriptions of the stepmother, it's interesting because you indeed see that on the one hand, Snow White's young age is being stressed more and more, but on the other hand, also the mother, and in those cases the stepmother's older age, is also stressed because the Grimms add the alte, or the old one, several times. And at the end, when Snow White is a queen herself, they highlight that the young queen, Snow White, is much more beautiful than the old one. So not only is Snow White's childness stressed, but also the stepmother's older age. But nevertheless, this raises questions, because when in Susan Pickard's book, for example, and in other scholars of age studies works, when they write about the cult of youth, that typically starts much earlier, in Snow White, that's cult of youth starts much earlier than in the examples that Pickard mentions. So in the sociological analysis of the cult of youth, typically they refer to girls in late adolescence and young adulthood, not children of 7 years old. And for me, that raises a question about Snow White and a potential contribution to age studies, because I think Snow White shows that stories have their own logic and their own genre conventions, and they may influence their construction of age. So indeed, the reference of youth that is so often explored in age studies takes a special form in fairy tales. So in age studies, it typically means that a person in early adulthood or late adolescence is favored over middle and older adulthood, but in fairy tales the rule is rather the younger the better. And this also comes apparent besides Snow White in stories where there are 3 siblings. So it's typically the youngest who's the most beautiful or the most successful. And if you've read Diana Wynne Jones's House Moving Castle, you may know that she parodies this convention, because the heroine, Sophie, thinks that nothing good will ever become of her because she's not the youngest but the eldest of 3 sisters. But then, of course, she does turn into the heroine of that book. But in fairy tales, even in youth and in childhood, being younger gives you an advantage. Moreover, if we then reflect on the mimetic dimension of character construction, fairy tales can also remind us of older age norms that have perhaps become obsolete in contemporary cultural practices, but that classic stories still perpetuate. Okay, sorry. Here's now missing a page. Okay, yeah. Right. So let's look into these older age norms that the Tale of Snow White may still capture. And now I'm jumping ahead to actually a story that does adapt Snow White's age to an older version. So the Disney movie is, of course, very influential in how we visualize Snow White. And in the opening scene, and now I'm looking at the 1937 movie, I'm not sure if and how it's been adapted in the most recent one, but in the opening scene of the 1937 animation, Snow White is called a maid. And in pre-modern times, the world that fairy tales evoke, maidenhood was, according to historian Kim Phillips, most often used for young unmarried women past childhood. So that is for girls in their teens. That model fits Disney, but it does, where Snow White indeed appears as an adolescent, but it does not fit Grimm. But nevertheless, when looking into historical reflections on age, I did come across various interesting ideas. So Kim Phillips has studied maidenhood in the late Middle Ages especially, and she describes how the transition from childhood to adulthood happened according to several criteria. And in our exploration of these criteria, it struck me that the age of 7 actually makes several appearances. So in religious terms, it was seen as the start of the age of reason, and the youngest age at which children could do a confession and have their confirmation. In medieval schemes for the 7 ages of man, the age of 7 also marked the transition from infancia, which was from 0 to 6 years old, to pueritia, which ran from 7 to 14. In addition, Phillips notes that medieval canon law marks 7 as the minimal age for which marriage could be contracted. And when talking about this with a colleague in law studies, he reminded me that, of course, the Grimms were trained as, legal professionals, were in close contact with Carl von Saint-Vigny, and would have been highly aware of this age of 7. But in all these instances, 7 is sort of the lowest age for a gray zone between childhood and adolescence. Adolescence avant la lettre, because it didn't exist yet as such a clear phase in life as we know it today. What did strike me, however, was that in all those criteria and explorations that I've read for that age of transition from childhood to adulthood, beauty is not mentioned as an aspect of the 7-year-old. In fact, it's typically associated with the older age of maidenhood. So in a girl acquiring beauty from the English medieval romance Les Lefrens, it's the girl's 12th birthday that marks her acquisition of beauty, desirability, and intellectual capacity, Phillips notes. And she also notes that the ages of some Middle English literary heroines who are described as beautiful are stated, and they are always in their teens. And similar examples from young girls who are presented as beautiful and desirable in 18th century writing, such as Diderot's young girl crying over a dead bird, it's the image on the right, Rousseau's Anzoletta, Goethe's Mignon, the image on the left, or Casanova's Barberina. These are all girls in their early teens, with 12 as the youngest. And if we think of Nabokov's Lolita, a more contemporary example, she's also 12. Yeah? So perhaps another aspect of Snow White's age comes into play here. And there is a saying that's sometimes attributed to the Jesuit St. Ignatius Loyola and sometimes to Aristotle, and that runs, "Give me a child until he is 7 and I will show you the man." What's expressed here in this saying is that a person's character is shaped by the age of 7. Now, we do have to acknowledge that in the case of Snow White, she's not a man, but also second, we really don't know much about Snow White until, that moment where she's called the most beautiful in the world, because those passages are just skipped in the story. But what we do know is what she's capable of next. And for this, I would like to turn again to the genesis of the Grimm tale. I think this is a very famous example. So remember that 7 was added in the 1812 first edition. One of the most expanded scenes in that same edition is the list of tasks that Snow White gets from the 7 dwarfs in exchange for letting her stay at their house. So in 1810, she gets a good deal. The list is modest. She only has to cook their food. But by 1812, the terms of the contract change. And Snow White is told that she has to, quote, keep their household, cook, sew, make the beds, do laundry, knit clothes, and keep everything orderly and clean. And to remind her, they end by saying that really dinner has to be ready when they get home. So in short, the list of tasks and skills that she needs gets considerably longer. In fact, I have to acknowledge that I would not be able to do many of the things that are listed here. So perhaps when we interpret Snow White's age, we should not just consider who she is or what she looks like, but also what she can do, what she's capable of, what in age studies would be called her functional age. And if we look at this from a historical perspective, Joanne M. Ferraro writes about childhood in the medieval and early modern period, that responsibilities grew exponentially between the ages of 7 and 12 when it came to domestic service tasks. Moreover, many children lived with their parents at least until the age of 7, but thereafter their lives diverged. And similarly, Carl Ibsen writes about the empirical age in Britain that by the age of 6 or 7, children might start to work. And that is actually what Snow White also does. She leaves home and she goes to work. Ferraro continues about the medieval and early modern period that the age of 7 was in many ways a turning point in attitudes about childhood, especially with the onset of religious reformations in attitudes about childhood. In Protestant households, 7 was the age when fathers assumed greater responsibility for child rearing and building moral character. In Catholic communities, 7 was the age when children were old enough to account for committing mortal sin. Children from the elite classes obtained some type of formal education beginning at age 7. Others instead took on the tasks and trades associated with their future livelihoods. The quote contains various ideas that I want to unpick. First, let's start with the role of the father. And as various critics have noted, the father sort of disappears from the Grimm story after she is born or after he's married the stepmother. Now, in some ways, you could say that the dwarves take over that role of giving Snow White a moral and practical education. And keep in mind here that the dwarves are very different from the ones in Disney. So in Disney, they are more childlike, and she is a mother to them, teaching them how to wash their hands, how to take a bath, and so forth. These are not the dwarves that we find in Grimm. Yeah. So in Grimm, their house may be small, but it's perfectly kept. Yeah, it's not this big mess with dirty dishes that Snow White finds in the Disney movie. It's perfectly kept. And when she's sleeping in one of their beds, the one who's lost his bed sleeps with the other dwarfs 1 hour with each. So they have a great sense of fairness, yeah? And you could say that they also contribute to her moral education by showing her a capacity that the queen does not have, yeah? They show pity and they help her, they help to protect her. Now, of course, you can say that some self-interest is implied in the long list of tasks that they give her. At the same time, they may be educating Snow White in a more practical manner because she, by getting this training, of course, in many ways becomes the perfect housewife. And without the prince, this may have very well been her future livelihood, to quote Ferraro, and it certainly would have been the case for many of the child readers' future prospects, for whom Snow White may serve as a role model in this 19th century logic. From an anthropological perspective, N.J. Girardot also sees Snow White's life with the 7 dwarfs as a sort of test. He also stresses that at the age of 7, sorry, I don't have that quote on the slide, but quote, at the age of 7, quote, Snow White is at the threshold of the passage to puberty and adult married life. Now this may come as a surprise, 7, as the start of puberty, but Girardot refers to Arnold van Gennep's anthropological perspective, saying that puberty should be understood here in a sociological and not in biological terms. So Girardot reads her expulsion and life with the 7 dwarfs as an initiation rite where her capacities for adulthood are put to the test. Now, in all the different perspectives on Snow White's age that I've offered so far, we see a tension between, on the one hand, an impulse to make her more childlike and smaller, and on the other hand, to cast her as a girl ready to enter work, puberty, and even adulthood. So we feel that tension. But now I want to return to that idea of beauty, which I've moved to the background a little bit, but now want to focus on again. Because, of course, that idea of beauty is explicitly linked to the age of 7. What do we do with that? And in the final part of my talk, I want to turn to the illustrations, as I promised. So like translations, they've really contributed to the rich history and also the success of the fairy tale. And they're also interesting to consider from an age studies perspective for at least 2 reasons. First of all, they give further insight into how the cult of youth is shaped when it is applied to a child of 7. And second, looking at the illustrations from an age studies perspective can also help to lay bare the illustrator's creativity in dealing with the fluidity and the ambivalences of age in the story and in the broader historical context. So, at the age of 7, we know that Snow White becomes a threat to her stepmother once she is the most beautiful. But what does it mean to be the most beautiful? Perhaps this childlike beauty is not necessarily the same as being desirable. And the Flemish critic Erik Wilses considers that age of 7 as part of the desexualization of the fairy tale. He thinks that it would have been quite a different story if Snow White had been a woman from the start. When there's jealousy between women because of one's beauty, then the sexual implications of that jealousy are more than clear, he writes. They want to be the most beautiful for the men, right? By making Snow White 7 years old, the Grimms have eliminated that sexual component, according to Hilses. But other critics would disagree, psychoanalysts for sure, but also some cultural historians. And here it's interesting to consider that, of course, the Grimm Snow White was published in the 19th century and immediately captured the imagination of many illustrators. First in the UK and Germany, and soon in various other European countries. And in her inspiring work of on images of childhood in the 19th century, Anne Higonet observes that the adorable child was also a desirable child. Desirable in the sense of sexually desirable. She refers in this context to Lewis Carroll's pictures. We've already seen some of those in Alessandro's presentation, including this one of Alice Liddell. Here I can make a connection to Anna's talk, the inspiration for Alice in Wonderland. And many of Carroll's and other images of innocent children in the 19th century have been interpreted as both innocent and sexually charged. And I think that also helped for the pictures that you showed, Alessandro. And of course, we know this is a topic that James Kincaid has also explored in his book on childhood in the Victorian age, where he argues that childlike innocence can paradoxically lead to the erotization of the child. So he points out that innocence is a denial of knowledge or guilt in the child, and he sees that as a form of hollowing out the child. So he says, this hollowing out of children by way of purifying them of any stains or any substance also makes them radically different radically different from adults. In this empty state, they present themselves as candidates for being filled with, among other things, desire. The asexual child is not any the less erotic, but rather more. And this mixture of innocence and desirability is also part of the history of fairy tales, such as Gustave Doré's pictures of Little Red Riding Hood, which have also been interpreted as both innocent and displaying a desirable child. And the combination of desirability and innocence and vulnerability is also something that you sometimes see in 19th century illustrations to Snow White, especially in the scene where she is sleeping in one of the seven dwarfs' bed, such as here. This is an illustration by the German illustrator Roland Risse. Now, that being said, I do want to acknowledge that establishing desirability and erotization in images is sometimes tricky and debatable, but also the same goes for interpreting age visually. And this challenge only increases for historical material. So visual aspects that may guide our interpretation of age in depicted figures include clothing, the presence or absence of signs of puberty, height, relative bodily proportions, and context. And as I was trying to make sense of the age of Snow White in various illustrations, I often find that extremely difficult. And I also started to realize that this difficulty may well have sometimes been deliberate. Because as we are dealing with a text that keeps the age of the main character fluid and ambivalent, especially after she's arrived at the Seven Dwarfs' house, so do the illustrations adopt various optical tricks to obscure age. And that contributes to constructing age as a very fluid and debatable concept. Now let's start with clothing, for example. And I've first shown an image or a set of images where I think that here the process of growing up is actually clearly marked. So these are images by Robert Geisler from the 1890s. And you can see that Snow White has grown if you look at her yellow dress. So when she is 7, it still reaches her full length. But when the stepmother offers her the poisoned comb, we see that the dress has shrunk to her knees. And we can assume that the girl has grown up in the meantime. Yeah? So the dress sort of marks a difference in length. In the anonymous illustrations that accompany a text in rhyme by the Dutch author Georges from the 1870s or 80s, we also see a shift in Snow White that may mark her process of growing up, but this is mostly done through her hairstyle. So in the beginning she's wearing pigtails that mark her as childlike, and then her hair is tied in a wreath, and then she has completely loose hair. But what I find interesting here is that her clothes do stay more or less the same through the entire process. So it's a little bit like a comic book where the outfit helps to make them recognizable throughout the story, even if the fact that she keeps wearing the same clothes somehow counteracts the idea of growth. So it's already ambivalent. But at the same time, these are some of the images where I was having trouble interpreting the height of Snow White, because of course she's kneeling in that first image, and she is positioned vis-a-vis the seven dwarfs in the second image. So the first may make her look smaller than she actually is by kneeling, but the second image may very well make her look bigger. Because imagine that she is here potentially very tall in a very small house. Yeah? And we see something similar in this image by Karl Ofterdinger, images from the 1890s again. So here we see that the way that the images are cut off obscure her height. The fact that she's sitting in the scene where the evil stepmother dances herself to death also makes it unclear to tell how tall she is. And also look how the coffin is cut off. So again, these are all ways of obscuring Snow White's height and potentially her age. And a very useful scene in that respect is the scene where she accepts the apple. So these are again anonymous illustrations, very early ones, in a Dutch translation by Gouverneur. Notice how small she is in the top left corner. Here she might be, to me she comes across as younger than 7. At the end she seems to have grown up, although the illustrator has made a mistake here. So here the illustrator also uses that yellow dress to keep her recognizable, but notice that it's the stepmother dancing herself to death who's wearing that dress. So I think maybe they got a little confused. But how tall she becomes in the meantime, again, is hard to tell. And here the way that the image is cut off, and that's the same for many other illustrations, when she accepts the poisoned apple, helps to keep her age multi-interpretable. Okay. So these are just a few examples, but I've seen many more like this, and if you start looking for them, it's interesting to see how illustrators play with this. And then I come to my conclusion. So it's often said that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's a common expression, but I think one of the most important insights that age studies offers is that age is also in the eye of the beholder. Human bodies may have or be a certain age, but the meaning that we assign to that age is subject to interpretation and change. Snow White's 7 years may be an aesthetic choice for numerical consistency, and combined with other additions in the text, they may, this age may serve to make her young enough to eliminate any erotic tension from the tale, which would be consistent with other changes. Think here, for example, also of the deletion of Rapunzel's pregnancy. But paradoxically, the insistence on Snow White's innocence and vulnerability may also make her all the more desirable. And this is, of course, also a point that feminist scholars, such as Sarah Gilbert, Susan Goober, and Andrea Dworkin have made. They say that, perhaps Snow White is not just the most beautiful in the world, but also the most angelic and perhaps also the meekest in the world. And yet, with her 7 years, Snow White has also shown herself to be capable to run an entire household of 8 people on her own, adapting very quickly to a new environment. Some critics are even willing to stretch the limits of puberty to argue that she has at least symbolically entered that liminal stage. Some have also felt less comfortable with Snow White's age as the moment in which she is marked as the most beautiful. And I'm showing an image here to show that how flexible and how fluid her age has been interpreted by illustrators. Yeah, so these are both the same scenes. The one where she drinks from the 7 dwarfs' cup when she arrives at their house. The same scenes, but a very different image. Translators, illustrators, and authors who have written fairy tales have often adapted Snow White's age, and usually putting her more firmly in an older age range, or to play with the ambivalences that the Grimm story leaves about her age. So the fairy tale allows this flexibility. I have to say, when starting this research, I feel that I've only really been able to scratch at the surface of this. And I've only, found some of the potential meanings. I know that many of you have a lot of knowledge about childhood in the 19th century. So I hope this talk may have inspired you to look at age more carefully. And I'm also very curious to hear your insights, comments, and questions. Thank you so much.